The ground was as hard as the souls of the men who walked on it. Red dust covered everything, from the forgotten altar of the chapel to the clotheslines where sheets turned gray before they even dried. It was 1882, and the village of Piedra Branca barely showed up on frontier maps. On the Mexican side, buried between the mountains and the desert, families survived in silence, with downcast eyes and sun-scorched shoulders. The Civil War had ended years before, but its scars still crossed the border in the eyes of those who passed through. There, on the edge of the settlement, lived Soledad. Her name meant loneliness, and no one could hold her gaze for long. She was too young to be that firm. Women said she had a sharp tongue, but never said it out loud, because they knew every woman who spoke too much ended up with her head bowed, her wrists marked, or worse, forced into silence. Soledad never bowed. She walked through the village with her head high and her bare feet steady, carrying water in a wooden bucket like she carried questions. She didn't attend church. She took no orders from men or priests. One day, in front of old Molina, the village chief, a man with a swollen belly and eyebrows like warring mustaches, she said women had the right to learn to read. He laughed. The other men laughed too, but they laughed like spitting stones. From that day on, they watched her like a hunter watches a fox. The houses were made of mud and silence. Inside, women whispered their griefs while sewing mourning cloths. Outside, men decided what could and couldn't be said. Soledad defied these rules not with weapons or shouts, but with gestures. She taught little girls to read with torn newspapers, wrote names in the dirt with her finger, and said women weren't animals to be kept by walls. Mothers feared for her. Her own mother, Dolores, preferred to pretend her daughter was mute when people asked why she walked alone through the fields. But even a mother's silence has its limit. And it came one hot afternoon when Soledad interrupted a conversation among the village men beneath the weak shade of the fig tree. They were talking about the new tax imposed by the government, money the poor barely had, yet would be forced to give. Soledad, standing at the edge of the shadow, said in a steady voice, "Only the rich steal, and only the scared obey." A silence heavier than any gunshot followed. Some men turned away, others clenched their fists. Molina said nothing. He just stared, too long. That same night, under a sky filling with tiny stars, men knocked on Dolores's door. Two of them, faces hidden by kerchiefs. Soledad didn't scream when they grabbed her. She fought, but the force of those who fear losing power is stronger than truth. They dragged her to the dry field behind the abandoned barn. There, they tied her to a wooden post, the same post once used to tether wild goats. No speech, no warning. Just coarse ropes cutting her wrists and ankles. The men vanished like ghosts, and Soledad remained, standing, bound, facing the horizon as if it might break. The sun hadn't yet set. Orange light carved her face, revealing a streak of blood at her temple and dust on her lips. Minutes passed, then hours. No one came. Not her mother, not the women she taught. Those who saw pretended not to. Those who knew said it was deserved. Because in that land what frightened them wasn't a rebellious woman. It was the fear of what would happen if people started listening to her. Wind lifted the hem of her skirt. Her hands began to swell, her arms trembled, but not a sound left her mouth. No pleading, no prayer, just eyes fixed on something beyond the hills. Maybe freedom, maybe justice, maybe no one. It was at dusk that he appeared. A dusty gray horse emerged from behind the dry brush, as if the desert itself had birthed it. The man riding it carried the weight of someone who had walked too long without rest. A wide-brimmed hat, a coat darkened by time, scars on his face, not from knives, but from stories. A rifle was tied to the saddle, and his eyes were as silent as hers. He stopped a few paces away, didn't dismount, just watched. Long enough. Then slowly he slid down. From his boot, he pulled a small, bone-handled knife and walked toward her in silence. Soledad never broke eye contact, not even when he began cutting the ropes one by one. The sound of the fibers snapping was louder than the wind. When the bindings on her wrists gave way, she collapsed to her knees. But he held her, steady. Their eyes met, briefly, like two cracked mirrors recognizing each other. She tried to speak, but only her lips trembled. He said nothing, just offered his hand. And in that gesture, older than any war, something began that neither of them yet understood. She didn't ask where he came from, nor did he ask what they had done to her. In places like Piedra Branca, stories weren't told. They were buried, like bones under dry soil. Everyone knew they were there, but no one dared dig them up. He helped her onto his horse, lifting her gently as if she were made of smoke and bruises. She didn't protest. Her legs barely held. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them, hiding the shame of weakness. He mounted behind her, his presence solid and still. They rode in silence. The road to the edge of town was little more than a line through sagebrush and scorched earth. As they passed, eyes peeked through shutters. Women standing behind laundry lines held wet sheets like shields. Men sitting on porches froze with half-smoked cigars in their mouths. No one spoke. Not even the dogs barked. The image of a girl tied to a post and a stranger untying her had already woven itself into something larger than words. They stopped at the old sheep herder's hut, a clay and stone structure that had long since surrendered to spiders and dust. He dismounted and opened the crooked door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dry earth and old wood. A rusted lantern hung on a nail. He struck a match against his boot, and the flame lit up cobwebs and cracked walls. It was enough. She stepped in, slowly. Her feet dragged slightly, as though the ropes had left invisible chains. She said nothing, just looked around and sat on the ground by the wall. He placed the lantern near her and stepped back outside. He didn't ask to stay, didn't ask her name. He simply sat on the doorstep, rifle across his lap, and watched the darkness settle over the hills. The night was windless. Coyotes howled in the distance. Somewhere near the riverbed, a mule brayed, restless. The man didn't sleep. He leaned against the wall and let the hours pass like smoke from a chimney. Inside, Soledad lay curled on a mat of woven straw, her breath shallow. She dreamt of gallows made of fig trees and voices that whispered her name like a warning. When morning came, pale and gray, he stood and stretched. The bones in his back cracked like old wood. He walked to the well and drew water with a rope that frayed in his hand. When she awoke, he handed her a cup fashioned from a hollowed gourd. She drank without a word. "Do they always do that to women here?" he finally asked, his voice like gravel sliding across stone. She looked at him for a long time. Her lips moved, barely. "Only the ones who speak." He nodded once. The kind of nod that doesn't judge, just understands. After breakfast, hard bread and dried meat he pulled from his saddlebag. He offered her a ride back. She refused. Walked instead. Limbs stiff, but steady. She walked like someone returning to a place not to live in it, but to show it hadn't broken her. They entered the village just as church bells rang, though there hadn't been a priest there in years. The sound was made by a child pulling a rope, told to do so by old Molina himself. A sound meant to remind people who held the keys to their souls. The cowboy followed behind Soledad at a distance. The villagers parted like dry grass before a flame. Molina stood on the steps of the old town hall, chewing tobacco and watching her approach. He wore a vest now and a polished gun on his belt. He thought it gave him weight, authority. But as the girl approached, even he shifted his stance. She stopped just before him. Not a word, not a glare. Just stood, like she had the day before. But now her silence wasn't punishment. It was defiance. Behind her, the cowboy leaned against the hitching post, not smiling, just present. "You've caused enough stir, girl," Molina muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "It's time to be quiet." Soledad didn't flinch. "I was quiet," she said, her voice soft as dust. "While you took my brother to dig trenches for a war that wasn't ours. While my mother starved so you could tax the grain she grew. While my friend bled from your cousin's fists." Molina's face darkened, not with rage, but with fear. The kind of fear a man feels when a truth too old to bury rises again, clothed in flesh. She turned and walked away. The villagers didn't follow, but their eyes did. They watched her like someone who had seen a storm and survived it. And in their silence, something new began to breathe. The cowboy pushed off the post and followed, steps slow and even. That night, No one touched her door, and for the first time in years the wind changed direction. The next days passed in a way that only the wounded recognize, slow, quiet, like the hush before a thunderstorm that never fully arrives. Soledad stayed in the shepherd's hut. It had become her shelter, her exile, and her small kingdom of silence. She cleaned the floor with cloths torn from her own dress, patched up holes in the walls with mud and hay, and kept a fire going with wood stolen from the abandoned chapel fence. He came and went, the cowboy, always wordless. Sometimes he'd bring dried beans, other times tobacco or strips of cured deer meat. Once he brought a pair of old boots for her, too big, but warmer than bare feet. She thanked him with a nod, and he responded with one just the same. No more was needed, not then. In the mornings, he taught her how to hold the rifle, how to balance her breath with the pull of the trigger. He never asked why she wanted to learn. She never explained. The target was a clay jug perched on a fence post. She missed it often, swore under her breath. He said nothing, only repositioned her stance, her shoulder, her grip. She listened. At night, they sat outside by the fire. Coyotes howled. The moon cast silver along the cracked stones of the hills. Sometimes he would carve small figures out of wood, animals mostly. She watched him, her fingers curled around her knees. He carved like someone burying thoughts in the grain. She never asked what haunted him, but she knew something did. One night, the fire burned low and she finally spoke. "Did they take something from you?" He didn't look at her, just scraped another curl of wood. "More than I can name," he said. She nodded. It was enough. In the village, things had changed. Slowly, slightly, like moss creeping over stone. Children whispered about the girl who had returned from the post. Women passed glances under shawls. A young boy who once threw stones at stray dogs now left water by her door each morning. Small things. But change never comes like thunder. It comes like dust, steady and unnoticed, until everything is covered. Old Molina, however, had not forgotten. On the 7th day he called for a meeting. Only men. Only the ones who still feared that if a girl could stand after what they did to her, maybe their power wasn't real. They gathered in the town hall, boots thudding on wooden floors, chairs creaking. Guns were laid on tables like confessions. "She's poisoning the women," one man said. "She's turning our children against us," said another. Molina spat tobacco into a rusted can. "She's not the danger," he said. "The man is." They all nodded. Later that night, 4 men left the meeting and rode toward the shepherd's hut. One of them carried a rope, another a bottle of whiskey to wet the fire in their bellies. But when they arrived, the fire was already lit. Not from their hands, but hers. Soledad stood outside, lantern held high, rifle slung across her back like a spine. "I've got nothing left to burn," she said. "But if you step on this ground, I'll make sure you never do either." The men hesitated. She took one step forward, eyes like flint. That's when the cowboy stepped out from behind the hut, rifle already aimed, hat low over his eyes, no words. One of the men dropped the rope, another turned his horse, the others followed. She didn't chase them, didn't smile, just lowered the lantern and went back inside. The cowboy stayed outside, watching the dark. In the silence, she called out to him, "Why do you help me?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Because someone should have helped my sister." She didn't ask more. They didn't speak the rest of the night. But the air between them had changed. Not softer, but clearer, like a mirror wiped clean of dust. Dawn came early in the hills, spilling soft light over the fields like spilled milk across an old table. The dust had settled after the standoff, but everyone knew it wouldn't stay settled long. Piedra Branca was not a place where tension disappeared. It fermented. The village was quieter than usual. Women spoke in whispers and walked faster. The men pretended to be busy, but their eyes watched the horizon more than their work. At the hut, Soledad knelt in the garden she had started. She had cleared a patch of dry land with her hands, planting onions, cactus figs, and a single tomato seed someone had given her months ago. Her fingers were cracked and her nails full of dirt, but she worked with the quiet resolve of someone who knew roots were stronger than memories. The cowboy watched her from the shade. He chewed a piece of jerky and kept his rifle beside him. He had said even less than usual after the night of the threat. Something about him had closed again, like a book returned to a high shelf. That afternoon, she brought him a bowl of beans and sat across from him. For a while, neither ate. Finally, she asked, "Was it Melina?" He nodded. "He used to come to our home," she said. "When my father died, he brought bread, helped patch the roof. My mother cried from gratitude." She looked down at her hands. "And then he started coming too often, staying too long. He didn't ask the rest. He didn't need to. That's why I spoke," she said, "because I was tired of silence pretending to be safety." The cowboy finished the last of his beans and placed the bowl beside his boot. "He's not the kind to forget a wound," he said. Soledad looked up. "Neither am I." That evening, word spread through the village that Melina was sending for men from the other side of the border. Mercenaries, deserters, the kind of men who didn't ask questions. Rumor said they would come at dusk within 2 days, and the girl and the stranger would be gone by morning, either by horse or by burial. The villagers did nothing, said nothing. But in the corners of kitchens, some women packed food in sacks and left them near the path to the hut. Some children slipped candles and salt through the cracks in the door. The people were still afraid, but fear had started to take on a shape, a shadow, a name. The night before the threat was supposed to come, Soledad packed what little she had into a satchel, a torn book of poetry, her mother's rosary, and one of the wooden animals the cowboy had carved. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it inside like it was glass. He stood by the horse, checking the saddle. She came to him, the rifle slung across her back. "Will you run with me?" she asked. He looked at her. "I've done enough running," he said. She stepped closer. "You said someone should have helped your sister." He nodded. She held his gaze. "Then don't let them bury another one." He didn't speak, but his hand moved, rested gently on her shoulder, then dropped. It was the closest thing to a promise he could offer. They didn't sleep that night. They sat in the dark, backs against the wall, rifles loaded, eyes open. She spoke of things she had never said, of her father's kindness and her mother's laughter before sorrow. He spoke of a war that left too many men alive and too many good women alone. When the sky began to change, they rose. From the ridge, dust clouds appeared. Riders, fast, about 6 of them. The cowboy mounted first, helped Soledad onto the horse behind him, the rifle across his back, her arms around his waist. He turned once toward the village, where no one came to say goodbye, and then they rode, not toward escape, but toward the fire. The riders came with dust in their mouths and steel in their hands, 6 men on horseback, faces covered with cloth, rifles strapped across their backs, spurs clinking like loose teeth. They crossed the ridge fast, like wolves that smelled weakness. But they did not know what waited below. Soledad and the cowboy had taken position behind the ruins of the old granary. The walls were cracked, but thick. From there, they could see the trail winding down the hill. The morning light was harsh, white and ruthless. Everything was still, except for their breathing. He looked at her once. She looked back. No fear, just a calm that only comes to those who have already died once in their lives. "They'll come fast," he said. "So will the shot," she answered. They didn't need more words. Words had done enough. Now it was about silence and aim. The first 2 riders reached the clearing. The cowboy fired first. One dropped like a broken branch. The other stumbled, fell from his horse, and rolled into dust, his leg bleeding. The others scattered, dismounted, took cover. Gunfire began, loud and sudden, like the storm of 100 years breaking loose. Soledad didn't miss. Neither did he. But bullets don't know names. One grazed his arm. Blood soaked his sleeve. He winced but didn't stop. She reloaded with hands that barely trembled. For minutes that stretched like hours, the air filled with smoke, echo, and grit. And then, silence. 5 bodies in the dirt. One man crawled away limping, leaving a trail. He didn't look back. She lowered the rifle. He collapsed to one knee. She ran to him, tearing cloth from her skirt to wrap his arm. "I'm fine," he muttered. "You're bleeding." "I've bled worse." But his skin was pale, his breath ragged. She helped him into the shade, cradled his head on her lap. He stared at the sky. "I thought I'd die somewhere empty," he whispered. "Not beside someone who mattered." She brushed dust from his cheek with the back of her fingers. "You won't die. You don't know that." "I do," she said, steady as stone. From the distance, horses approached. Not enemies this time. Villagers, men, women, children, walking, quiet, unarmed. At first just a few, then more. Faces drawn, feet dragging. They gathered around the fallen bodies, the smoke, the broken ground. No one spoke. Then an old woman stepped forward. She held something in her hands. Bread, still warm. She placed it beside Soledad, then touched her arm and whispered, "Forgive us." Another brought water. Another, a blanket. They didn't ask for permission. They began to bury the dead. The man who crawled away had disappeared, into desert or shame. It didn't matter. When the sun began to lower again, the cowboy slept, fevered, but breathing. Soledad watched the villagers work, the children dig, the women sing a low hymn without words. It was not redemption, but it was beginning. She stood, back straight, hair tangled, dress torn. And in that moment, she wasn't the girl who had been tied to a post. She was the reason no girl ever would be again. For 3 days, the wind carried the scent of burned gunpowder and soil turned by shovels. It moved through the hills like an old mule, slow, aching, carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. The villagers came and went from the hut without knocking. They brought what they could: dried corn, firewood, sometimes just silence. The cowboy healed slowly. The fever gripped him at night like an angry hand. Soledad bathed his forehead with damp cloths and murmured prayers she didn't believe in. She fed him spoonfuls of broth made from chicken someone had left at their door. When he shook from the heat in his bones, she sat beside him and placed her hand on his chest, not to hold him back from dying, but to remind him he wasn't alone in it. On the 4th morning, he woke, with his eyes clear. "You stayed," he said. She didn't answer, just tucked the blanket around him and went to stir the coals. He sat up, slowly. His body remembered pain. His fingers trembled when he reached for the tin cup, but he drank, and she watched. And something passed between them. Not new, not sudden, just finally seen. That afternoon they walked, first to the river, where the water moved in thick ribbons over stones the color of ash. Then to the edge of town, where the children played near the fig tree, the same one where the old men once gathered to decide who would be punished and who would be invisible. The tree was quiet now. Nobody sat beneath it. Molina was gone. No one said where. Some said he fled at night, with only a mule and his gun. Others whispered that the earth took him, tired of carrying his weight. Soledad never asked. Some things are better left to the wind. One evening, she returned to her mother's house. Dolores opened the door with hands that didn't know what to do. Touch her, scold her, hold her. So she stepped aside. Soledad entered and sat where her father once sat. The same spot. The room was smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she was finally big enough to see it all. They ate in silence. Tortillas, cheese, dried herbs. Her mother never asked about the blood, never asked about the man who waited outside. But when the plates were cleared, she placed a rosary in her daughter's palm. No words, just the weight of memory between them. That night, back at the hut, the cowboy sat near the fire sharpening his knife. Soledad handed him a piece of leather, rolled and tied. Inside it, the last of her father's bullets. "Use it well," she said. He nodded, then looked at her, long, like someone seeing not just a face but a whole future. And she looked back, not as a girl who had survived, but as a woman who no longer waited to be saved. In the morning, she saddled the horse. He packed the rifle. They didn't speak of where they were going, just rode. Past the post where she had once been tied. Past the fig tree, the chapel, the last house. Into the land where names don't matter and justice is not written but carried. In calloused hands, in the set of a jaw, in the silence of two people riding side by side. The wind followed behind, but it didn't catch them. It never would. They didn't take the road north. Roads were for those looking to be found. They rode west, where the land curled into canyons and arroyos, where the sky widened so far that even grief felt smaller under it. Each morning brought a different silence between them. Not the silence of strangers, that brittle, frightened hush, but something old and patient, like a tree that had learned not to reach for answers, only sunlight. They stopped at abandoned ranches, watered the horse at wells where birds dipped low and vanished, slept beneath cliffs that watched without blinking. He always built the fire. She always cooked. Neither claimed more than they needed. They shared like people who'd once had everything taken and didn't want to owe the world again. On the 5th day, they passed through a town with no name. A church still stood, leaning sideways. A man with no legs played a harmonica by a stump. He didn't ask who they were. He just nodded and played slower. In that town, Soledad bought a dress. Not new, but clean. White cotton, sleeves torn, mended in haste by someone who had once loved carefully. She tried it on in the back room of a store that smelled of horses and tobacco. When she came out, the cowboy didn't say a word, but he looked at her longer than usual. That night she cut her hair by firelight, not out of shame, not for anyone else, just to feel what it was like to shed something without pain. The strands fell into the fire like ashes, curling before they vanished. He watched without comment. When she was done, she handed him the knife. "Your turn." He didn't smile, but he took the blade, cut his beard close. The hair fell onto the dirt and stayed. He left it there. They moved on. In another village, she traded a silver ring, her mother's, once hidden in bread during wartime, for paper and a stub of charcoal. She began to write. Not stories, just fragments. Names of the dead. Names of the women who'd stayed quiet. Names of the girls who hadn't returned. She buried the papers in dry soil near mesquite trees. One day they passed a farm where children ran barefoot through cactus shade. A woman stirred corn in a clay pot over a fire. She invited them to eat. They sat, grateful. The food tasted like dust and roots. And home. When they left, the woman pressed a rosary into Soledad's hand. "Keep walking," she said. They did. Miles later, in a place where the river split in two like a cracked mouth, they stopped. He pointed to a rise of land. "Build there," he said. "Why?" "Because you never had a place that couldn't be taken." So she built. Not a house, not yet, but a shape. Rocks marked the corners, a trench for the water, a place to start again. Each day they built more. A wall, a roof, a fire pit. They spoke less, but touched more. Not like lovers, but like people who knew the price of absence. One evening she found him sitting with his back to a tree, his hands shaking. "You all right?" "Sometimes I see her," he whispered. "My sister." "In the faces of the ones we pass." She sat beside him. Didn't ask more. He turned. "I think if I'd had your voice back then, maybe she'd still be alive." Soledad didn't speak. She only laid her head on his shoulder and stayed. Weeks passed. Then months. The house took form. Small, firm. Smoke rose from the chimney. Birds nested in the rafters. They had neighbors now, not many. A widow with goats. A boy who limped from a mine accident. A girl who never spoke, but watched Soledad like one watches a storm returning. One day, the girl came with a flower. Didn't say a word, just held it out. Soledad took it, placed it on the windowsill. The cowboy watched from a distance, carving again. This time, not animals. A face. Soledad's. The first rains came, woke them in the night. Soledad stood at the door, watching water hit the ground and not be swallowed. The land was changing, not healed, but softened. She turned to the man inside, her rifle by the door, her name stitched into the seams of a place no longer borrowed. He looked up, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from that post, he smiled.